Hello and welcome to another special edition of the State of Politics. We are on to give our reaction, run through some results, what we've seen in pattern terms through the election in terms of voting, where the big winners are, where the big losers are, how different parties got on. So we'll be on for an hour and we'll be chatting through. If you've got any comments, fire them in. We get great engagement the other day in our build up to the election. So please fire in anything you've got to ask about, anything you want to talk about, whether that's even the system. I know there was a little bit of confusion probably with people yesterday when the regional votes came out. So if we can try and explain that, we shall do so. So Patrick, 2 days, it's been a bit crazy. It's not been like a typical election. I imagine you're not as tired as you probably would have been this time around.
No, I certainly don't miss the tiredness. You sort of miss the overnight counts. I think it's a special part of election night. Obviously, it was election day, election weekend this time round. But yeah, it's not as tired, and some very, very interesting results. What did you make of them?
I thought it was very interesting. Again, we did this and we did our predictions. You thought the SNP would get a majority. I wasn't too sure about that due to the way the system works. They've obviously increased their seats as well as the Greens, the only two parties that did increase their seats in this election. I think now there is a mandate for a referendum, and that will come. I think we've just saw Andrew Marr this morning and Michael Gove's tune has changed a wee bit. If anybody's not seen Andrew Marr this morning, when asked would he take the Scottish Government to court, he said no. So it looks as if the tune has changed. What about you? What was your thoughts on it?
Obviously, my prediction didn't come true. The SNP didn't receive a majority. The Tories performed a lot better than I thought they would. They got their exact 2016 result, and I think they get a higher percentage of the vote. They get 0.5% more. So it's a record result for them. Labour went backwards. I think certainly before Anas Sarwar became leader, you would have expected that. His personal ratings are extremely high, and it's a credit to him that they're so high. But unfortunately for him, they haven't translated into votes for the Labour Party, so they've gone backwards by 2 seats down to 22. The Green Party, I think they were probably expecting more gains than what they got. I think there was a lot of polls that put them on double figures, and they didn't get that. They get 8 seats, which is still a great result, a record result. So I think that they might be quietly disappointed at that result, actually. And then the Liberal Democrats obviously lost a seat and will lose their two questions at First Minister's questions on a Thursday because they don't qualify as a party group. So yes, and also on a record turnout, the highest ever result for a Scottish parliamentary election, 63% turnout.
Yeah, I think that's something that's really important to know. I put out a tweet last night that, and the past couple of weeks, past couple of months, we saw the real nasty side of Scottish politics. We saw a lot of mud getting thrown about. We saw a lot of factions. We saw personalities clashing. Whereas on Thursday, whether people like the result or not, democratically, the people of Scotland turned out a more inclusive um, percentage of the vote share as well, because we had refugees voting for the first time in this election, more 16 and 17-year-olds and people that hadn't voted in the previous election voting, and they came out to vote, which was great. I think 70% at times in some places, which was record high voting numbers. At
Yeah,
kind of average 60 odds, which was still very, very positive. So that's always a positive, and it's something I think we should all be really, really proud about, that the Scottish people came out, because this election was going to decide their future. It will, as I said at the start of the show, we've got a pro-independence majority in the Scottish Parliament, which will definitely lead to another independence referendum.
yeah, and prisoners voted as well. I don't think all of them had the right to vote, but I think that most of them did, and a lot of them did vote. Um, I think it was Clydebank and Mulgai. That was the sort of early 70% turnout that we got through, and it was obviously one of the first to declare. But yeah, as you say, there will be a referendum. Nicola Sturgeon promised that if she was returned to government and if there was a pro-independence majority, which there is. So I think she'll have to press ahead with that, or else the people of Scotland will reject her in 5 years' time at the ballot box. So
Yeah.
she has to press ahead with that because of it was a massive election promise. And it should be interesting. Obviously, it won't happen anytime soon because the COVID recovery will come first. Every party agrees that should be the case. So I think it will at least be a year away, any referendum. And personally, I think it will be either late 2022 or late 2023. That's my guess.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Again, we saw a lot of political analysis over the past couple of days saying when is the recovery over, and that is something that I don't think any of us will know in terms of, how do you say the recovery period is over. So that's going to be very interesting to see. It's something that the union is certainly using in their argument, and it's maybe something that Boris Johnson might like in his favour. He will have a bit of time to try and work out how his side of the argument can win a referendum again. Of course, no in 2014 winning the referendum, 55%. Again, it's something that I think the Prime Minister will know we have to do, and whether or not he can do that is going to be very, very interesting. But I think what was really, really important to note was over 50% of the vote share in the Scottish Parliament was for pro-Indy parties. So as John Curtis said, who we're going to have on, I guess, which we're really, really looking forward to, Scotland is really split down the middle in the constitutional question.
Yeah, pro-independence vote share majority on the regional list. Not quite that on the constituency list, on the constituency vote total, but I think that's mainly because the Greens don't stand in the 73 constituencies. I think they only stood in 12 actually. So I think if they were to stand in the 61 others, you might get Green members who might have voted Labour or Lib Dem voting Green. And I think if they were in with a chance of winning a few seats, you might have seen them or other people voting Green. So it is basically split down the middle at the minute. It's very 50-50. I mean, 7 years ago when we had the referendum, it was very clearly 45-55. So that 5% gap has closed in 7 years. And with, I think it's 70 to 80% of young people supporting independence, that's only going to go in the independent side's favour. So I actually think the longer that Boris Johnson waits for a referendum, the worse it could be for the UK. It might not be terribly bad for Boris Johnson. We don't know how long he's going to be Prime Minister. He could quite easily ignore Scotland, let independent support increase, and then just leave. So it could be a problem for, say, maybe Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer. But yes, it should be very interesting to see when a referendum takes place. And you mentioned Michael Gove's interview there. He says that Scotland can secede from the UK. He said that they can do that through a legal referendum and that they're not going to challenge a referendum if the Scottish Government presses ahead with one. So it will be interesting whether they grant a Section 30 order or they just totally ignore a consultative referendum, which would leave us in a very strange position, because you might find that there's a perfectly legal referendum that hasn't been challenged, where the yes side wins, but then the UK government won't enter into negotiations with the Scottish government. And so this is where a sort of international sort of solidarity comes into play, where if countries like maybe Ireland or Norway or Germany, I think was mentioned in the news, recognise Scotland and say pressure the UK government to accept the will of the people, I think that could come into play in 2 or 3 years' time.
Yeah, well, you mentioned there Boris Johnson possibly leaving. We're not fazed by Prime Ministers buggering off after big constitutional questions, are we? That is something that is going to be very, very interesting, because it could happen, and we've saw reports that it is possible that the SNP will become a bit charm offensive in the coming months with other EU countries in order to try and get a result recognised. We do not certainly want a Catalonia episode where we see a wildcat referendum, something that the Tories keep saying, but the Scottish Government are ruling out completely. Douglas Hepburn comes in a really good point here, Patrick, saying 37% not voting is still high and makes it hard to judge whether independence is achievable. Now, on that 37%, how do you think we can make more people turn out? I mean, as much as we were praising there a very high percentage of the vote, it's a good step forward. We know we're going to try and get Kezia Dugdale on the show, works for the John Smith Institute, talks about political engagement. How do we try and get more people to engage in Scottish politics? Because again, it's still been a definitely high turnout, but how do we get that wee bit extra more to turn out?
Well, I think obviously it's a record high turnout. That's brilliant. I think it's a 7.5% increase on the last time, and I think the last time was a record turnout as well. So it's going up, and that's obviously a good thing. And it's almost reaching the sort of Westminster average of about 65, 67. So that is obviously positive. Getting people to turn out, I think it's Australia that does mandatory voting, and it's something I've sort of argued in my head with myself about whether that's a good thing or not. It would certainly get you to over 90%. You might get a hell of a lot of spoiled ballot papers. You might get more people engaged in the political scene. But also, people who aren't voting tend to be of a lower income, and say fining them 50, 100, £200 for not being politically aware is quite, I'd say, immoral, really. And I think it's quite a tough sell. Apart from that, how to get people politically engaged, it was obviously difficult this time because you couldn't knock on people's doors. But at the same time, everyone was inside watching the briefings, watching the party political broadcasts. They were probably reading the leaflets through their doors for the first time. In other elections, they might have just gone straight in the bin. And also, with the amount of involvement that devolved governments have had over the course of the pandemic, people have seen how engaged a devolved government is and how important it is. So maybe they're taking the election more seriously. So if they see more action from the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government, they might look and say, well, this is really important, and turn out to vote next time. So it is a tough one, but mandatory voting is one option.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at Wales as well, we'll touch on the other elections that we saw this week, but again, showed the power of a devolved party, and I think that when you contrast Keir Starmer's performance in England compared to Mark Drakeford's performance in Wales, it's all down to Mark Drakeford's past year of excellent leadership in Wales, and the same goes for Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland. You know, when you become a face and people start to get to know you, whether they think you're doing a good job or a bad job, they will decide in it, and inevitably, you know, Scottish Tories try to take down John Swinney and Nicola Sturgeon with votes of no confidence, whereas the people of Scotland have installed their trust back in both of them. So it's very interesting to see. But yeah, you know, it would be great. A lot of people talk about a referendum being divisive and it splits people. I actually think we can be quite positive in terms of people engaging because it's such a big question. We saw a record turnout of voters at the last referendum, and it will make people more politically engaged. Will get them to register to vote and whatnot. So that will be interesting to see. It's a good point that Douglas makes, and we thank him for getting in the comments. If anybody else wants to get in, that's fine. Going to move on to the parties. Have a look through the parties. So we'll start with what would be the winners of the election, the Scottish National Party. They went with a both votes SNP tact. Do you think it worked? Do you think they got the result they wanted? I know a lot of people, even broadcasters, were saying, you know, no majority, probably not what they're happy with. How do you think the party will be feeling after yesterday's election results?
Well, a fourth term in government, which will give them another 5 years. It will take them to 19 years in government unless there's a no confidence vote. I think they'll be happy with that. It's certainly probably not what they expected back in 2007 when they first got into power, winning by one seat. There were polls about a year ago when Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP's popularity was at its all-time highest, where I think we were predicted with a seat projection of 72 or 73. So obviously, these are the best possible scenarios. These don't always happen. They very rarely happen. I think the SNP would have hoped for a majority. I think that's why the both votes SNP tactic was used. It also makes perfectly common sense for a party to tell voters to vote for them as much as possible. Why would they advocate voting for another party? That doesn't make any sense. So I think they were quite close in quite a lot of lists. I think they could have got one in the west of Scotland. I think they could have got one in mid Scotland and Fife. I think there were rumours that the Alba party actually cost them one in the northeast. And I think in Lothian there was an outside chance, but I don't think they were close enough. So, and then obviously Dumbarton was marginal. It was 109 seats last time. Jackie Baillie increased a majority. So it's the small margins that really matter, and they've just missed out this time. But I think they'll be more than happy that after the last 5 years, how much has gone on in British politics with Brexit and the pandemic to actually gain a seat and get another 5 years in government is phenomenal.
Yeah, I think whether you like them or you dislike them, 14 years in government and again to win an election and pick up seats after that, pick up seats after a year for that everybody's from Tellis, it is a real achievement for Nicola Sturgeon and our party. So I think they will be happy. And it's something, the both forced SNP tactic nearly did work, as you say. So, I think it's right to point out that people will have criticised the system and why they did that, but they're not going to advocate to vote for another party. Why would you put somebody in the card if you're going to, put them up, pay for them, and then say, listen, guys, don't vote for them? It came very close, and I don't think, again, you saw the actual transfer of that first SNP vote on the constituency over to the list area like Glasgow. Don't think they get as many votes, but as if they did, they would have got Rosa Sala probably over the line. So it'll be interesting to see how the party actually approach that in the coming years, because what we're going to get over to later on is tactical voting, playing the system, and how that benefited the unionist side more than it did the nationalist. So that's us in what is going to be the party of government. We will have Nicola Sturgeon as a First Minister again. Do you see a change of cabinet happening there? I know obviously we're going to lose positions like Maureen Watt, Rosanna Cunningham, Jean Freeman. What kind of cabinet? What do you think cabinet's going to be looking like come next week?
Yeah, well, you touch on there, we're going to be losing 3 people voluntarily because they're not standing again. You're also going to lose Paul Wheelhouse, who stood in Ettrick and I think lost by about 7,000 votes. I don't think we ever truly thought we were going to win that constituency. He was third on the list. That was probably his best shot. But by getting East Lothian and Ayr, that was kind of ruled out. So commiserations to Paul Wheelhouse. He'll be another minister that's lost. I think we've spoken on the show quite a few times about a potential SNP Green formal coalition. I think we would have heard that from Nicola Sturgeon yesterday in her speech if that was on the cards. I don't think that's happening. So I think it will be an SNP cabinet. Well, you get people like CoCab, we'll come on to that later. She won in Glasgow Kelvin, replacing Sandra White. She's an expert on education, so you could see her in a position like that. You've also got tremendously qualified people like Angus Robertson winning. You could see him in the cabinet. In fact, I'd say he's a stick-on for a cabinet position. And you've got perfectly qualified people behind the scenes in the party. This is another thing we've spoken about, that the Parliament possibly needing more MSPs, because anyone you pick for a cabinet position probably already has 2 committee roles, and those committee roles will have to go elsewhere now. So the 64 SNP MSPs will have their work cut out for them, whether they're backbenchers and committee members or whether they're a minister.
And that goes as well for the Lib Dems, who've only got 4 MSPs that are going to need to stick themselves right across committees. Sorry. I think Angus Robertson's a good point. We probably will see him in cabinet. We could see CoCab Stewart. John Swinney will still have his position, I'm sure, in there. We also saw some real fresh faces coming in. Mary McCallan coming in, possibly maybe in as a junior minister. Trying to think who else. Obviously, I never mentioned the department. Mike Russell will go. It could be a position for
Another
Angus
massive
Robertson
loss.
to take. Yeah, it is for the party. We could see Angus Robertson get into that position, I think. But, there's a lot of fresh faces in there. There's a lot of former junior ministers. Even Jenny Goldroof is a person I could see possibly having a cabinet position. Maybe Kate Forbes into a position maybe like health, whether she'll continue on in finance. It's going to be something that'll be interesting. We'll probably once again see that gender balanced cabinet, which has proven to be positive. So we'll see how that works out in the coming week. We'll go into the opposition. Now, Scottish Tories looked as if they were in a bit of disarray when Jackson Carlaw departed. Saw Dougie Ross come in. He'll be very, very happy, I'm sure, even though he's lost Mr Brown and Ayr. I'm sure he'll be very, very happy with the result and retaining the opposition party.
John Scott in here, who is replaced by...
Why Brown? Did I get Brown from? John Brown, I think I know where I've got Brown from. John Scott, who we send our best regards to. John's had a very tough time recently, health-wise. So
Luckily
we send our very best regards to him. And commiserations to him and losing his seat. But back to the Scottish Tories, opposition, they'd be very, very happy about that, wouldn't
Absolutely delighted, and he'll be very emboldened. I've seen a tweet this morning already saying that they've equalled their highest ever seat share. They've got their highest ever vote share. It's a historic result because obviously they'll have their highest ever votes total as well because it's a high turnout. Just going back to the gender balance cabinet, I think in the last parliament there was only 33% women. That's now gone all the way up to 45%, which obviously isn't enough because I think there's 54% of Scotland is women, so you're probably looking for that number or maybe a 50-50 balance. But yeah, gender balance cabinet and closer to that 50-50 balance of men and women in parliament. On the opposition, they've definitely lost a talent in Ruth Davidson. She's down the way to the House of Lords to legislate for the rest of her life unelected. And I think you'll see people like Murdo Fraser, who lost to John Swinney in Perth again, and people like Liz Smith and Annie Wells is in. Stephen Kerr, who was the MP for Stirling and Westminster for 2.5 years, he's in the Central Scotland list. A real coup for them, I think, is Megan Gallagher, who was the third place Tory in the Central Scotland list. I think she was the leader of the Tories in North Lanarkshire Council. I'm not entirely sure, but she's meant to be a rising star in the party. So it's a great result, and I think they've got a lot of possible front benchers coming in.
Yes, front benchers, maybe not behind the best of leaders. And again, we're going to have a Scottish Tory leader who is not just an MSP, but also an MP and a linesman, which is very, very interesting. I don't know how he'll be able to do that, and is soon to be a new dad too. So he's certainly got his work cut out in the next few years. Whether or not he will vacate that seat at Westminster is still to be decided. Don't know if that he maybe kept it on just as a backup, but he certainly got in up in Murray on the list, not winning the seat. Mr. Lockhead winning that seat again, and hopefully he's okay too. Self-isolating due to the COVID outbreak up in Murray, and hopefully
he was at the count yesterday. He got a negative result.
I'm glad to hear that. So all the best to Mr. Lockhead. Well done on his re-election. And if anybody's tuning in from Murray, hopefully the situation up there calms down a wee bit. I know it's been a bit crazy. Hopefully that can be brought under control. So moving on from the Tories, Scottish Labour Party now, Anna Sawers, a lot of chat about where they've came in 10 weeks. They probably are maybe heading for a bigger disaster than they've actually had. But once again, they've went backward in Scotland. Where now for Scottish Labour?
Well, that is the question, because that is, they obviously, the highest ever seat total was their first election in 1999. They've gone backwards ever since. 2016 was, I think, their worst. I think they lost 15 seats. 2016, they've lost 2 this time. So that is the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats that have never made a gain in the whole history of devolution. That's 5 times they've either stood still or gone backwards. And when you combine the 2 seat shares, I think in the coalition, in the very first election, they were at about 70 seats. When you combine the 2 parties now, they're in 26. So that shows what the Scottish people think of the Labour and the Liberal Democrats 22 years on from devolution. Where do they go from here? I think Anna Sawers' personal ratings have been phenomenal. I mean, they're almost as high as Nicola Sturgeon, and Nicola Sturgeon's are always quite high. I think he'll definitely be the leader for the local elections next year. Because they had a bit of a disaster in 2017, I can see them making some gains, to be honest, in those local elections. Where they go from there, it's how good he does in the next 3 years that determines whether or not he'll be the leader for the 2024 Westminster election, whether or not Scotland becomes an independent country, because, you know, if Scotland votes to become independent, he might feel that he needs to resign. You just don't know. Whether he's the leader for the Scottish elections in 5 years' time, I think he was probably hoping to finish second so that he could position himself as an alternative First Minister in 2026. He can't do that now. So it's whether or not he lasts the 5 years.
Yeah, and I think if we go into another referendum campaign, it'll be interesting to see whether, again, Better Together get back together, or whether Anna Sawers would prefer Scottish Labour to run a whole different campaign. We've had Neil Finlay in the podcast, and he made it very clear to us he ran a different campaign from it. Whereas I think one of the real detrimental impacts that Scottish Labour have had in recent years is due to that campaign which they ran alongside the Scottish Tory Party in 2014.
Yeah, 100%. I think Neil campaigned with the Communist Party of Britain because I think they have a very clear structure in the Communist Party of how socialism can be achieved within the UK. And I think although the vast majority of left of centre individuals support independence, there is a clique there. Not a clique, it's bigger than a clique. But there is a group there that sees socialism within the UK as the way forward. And Neil is obviously one of those people. And Anas will be as well. So yeah, whether better together, get back together. I think officially in referenda, according
That
to the
seems like a bad 80s pop band type thing. Whether better together, we'll get back together.
No. A line in a pop song. I think under electoral commission or electoral law, there has to be one official campaign for yes, one official campaign for no. So it's about who's in that, what it's called, whether Anas Sarwar participates in that, because it will be almost certainly Tory-led, because the UK government will be Tory. I can quite clearly see Ruth Davidson being the figurehead in that, possibly Gordon Brown, but I think he's 71
it's making
now.
that difference with Gordon Brown as well, who would probably take Anna's side too.
Yeah. I mean, he became the de facto leader of the Better Together campaign in the last month of the 2014 referendum because Alistair Darling wasn't a great speaker, to put it mildly. So yeah, I can see Ruth Davidson leading the official campaign to keep the union together, and possibly Anas Sarwar and the Labour Party doing their own thing in any future potential referendum. But also, you could see a boycott, because if they go ahead with a referendum without a Section 30 order and the UK government don't challenge it, you could see a unionist boycott. And it's Anas Sarwar could be in a very difficult position of making a judgment call there.
Yes, well, certainly one former Labour Prime Minister I don't think we'll see anywhere near it is Tony Blair, who whose haircut, by the way, is absolutely wild. Have you seen it?
Yes,
It looks terrible.
It looks like a sort of evil figure in some sort of Game of Thrones type TV show.
I know some countries will certainly be an evil figure in. When he was promoting democracy back in the day, how times have changed for Tony Blair. Moving on from that, again, the Greens, we said earlier on that they probably will feel a wee bit disheartened, maybe that they're not picked up as much. But it's another good result for the Scottish Green Party. Again, two co-leaders, well done to Lorna Slater, who we had on the podcast. Commiserations to Kate Nevins, unfortunately not breaking through, but massive well done to Lorna Slater. Once again, the first fully recognised autistic person to be elected to Holyrood, so another great breakthrough. And I think they're going to make some impact in Holyrood once again. They did well in holding the Scottish Government to account the past 5 years. I think it'll be more of the same.
Yeah, they get quite a lot of budget concessions out of the Scottish Government for the 5 budgets. I think the Labour Party would tell you that they've passed on budget cuts from Westminster to local councils. I think when Lorna was on the podcast, or maybe I heard Patrick Harvey talk about it online, that they'd halted the cuts that was passed by Alex Salmond and Annabel Goldie in the early years, the SNP. But I mean, the concessions they got, obviously Labour brought forward a no confidence vote in John Swinney for the exam fiasco.
Yep.
The Greens managed to negotiate a teacher recommended grade being applied to all students who were downgraded. So that was a massive concession. That wasn't part of the budget negotiations. But in the budget negotiations, they got a more progressive tax system. I think 40% and 45% for the top earners was raised by 1% to 41 and 46. And then on the lower end, it was 20% get turned into 3 brackets of 19, 20 and 21. So small changes, but it is a more progressive tax system, and I think the lower earners pay the least amount of tax in the UK. So I think we'll just see that again, basically, for the next 5 years. So a great result for the Greens. Might have expected double figures, but you can't complain, and obviously congratulations to Lorna and commiserations to Kate.
Yeah, and I think actually one of the things I picked up yesterday off Twitter again was that I think it was the Central Scotland list Glasgow that they missed out due to people voting for what they thought was the Green Party that wasn't the Green Party. The Independent Green Voice, I think, is that their name?
Yeah, Independent
So
Green Voice, and I think they got something like 2,000 votes, and the Greens missed out by 1,000 votes. And I think they're a far right party that just care about
yeah,
the environment. So it's a bit of electoral sabotage, and I wonder if the Electoral Commission will be looking into that.
yeah, it will be interesting to see whether that changes again in the next Scottish election. If that is the case, because the Greens probably would have picked up another seat there. But again, it's still a good result, and as we've said, I think they will be a very key part in the next 5 years of the Scottish government in terms of budgets and in terms of that pro-independence majority. The Greens very clearly stood in a manifesto which stated they wanted another referendum, and that's something that will have to be pushed ahead. So on to the party that is no longer the party now in Holyrood officially, Scottish Liberal Democrats. Stonking majorities for Willie Rennie and the other guys in the constituencies. What can they do in the next parliament? Because people would look and think, oh, there's only four of them. What can they do?
Well, a stonking majority for three of them. One of them in Shetland.
Which
Obviously,
was cut.
their majority was cut. I think it was a 19% decrease for the Lib Dems and a 19% increase for Tom Wills in Shetland, the SNP candidate. And he ran a great, I think it was a council by-election campaign up in Shetland 3 years ago, and he almost got that. So he's ate into the majority again. And I think they've won every election in Shetland since 1945, if not before. So to come that close is absolutely phenomenal. And I think in the Shetland constituency on the list, obviously it's the Highlands and Islands list, but on the Shetland constituency, the SNP actually get more votes than the Lib Dems. So you can take that as a sort of small win. But yes, I think there was rumours of an Alex Cole-Hamilton leadership challenge. I don't think that's going to come to fruition. But Willie Rennie, he's been there for 10 years now. He's actually taking them backwards now. So it's whether he wants to stay on for another 5. To be perfectly honest, I can't see that. I can't see him leading the Lib Dems for another 5 years into another election where they could quite easily continue to go backwards because Shetland is now a marginal constituency.
Yeah, and I think even for him as well, from a personal perspective, a family life, it must be very difficult to, be away so much from. I know he's got young kids and whatnot. So for the next 5 years, Willie Rennie probably won't continue to be on as Liberal Democrat leader. What it does show, I think, if we look at the picture of this Parliament again, Patrick, is the majority of MSPs in it are central left. So in terms of progressiveness, from the SNP, Scottish Greens, and Scottish Labour, we're going to have a Parliament that is very, very different to what we actually saw in the results in England.
Very different, extremely different. You saw, just to touch on the local results in England very briefly, voters totally abandoning the Labour Party in their swathes, in their droves. I think they lost about 200 councillors and they lost 4 or 5 councils. You've seen unbelievable swings to the Green Party of about 50%. They went from a standing start of 0 to about 53, I think, in places in Sunderland and Liverpool. I think you've seen the Lib Dems gain quite a few seats in Sunderland. Obviously, the Tories will have taken a lot of the Labour seats. But yes, in comparison to Scotland, Labour have obviously gone backwards, but not as far back as they have in England. And terrible results for Keir Starmer. His personal ratings are awful as well. So it'll be very, very interesting.
Yeah, I asked you earlier on where the Scottish Labour go at this point in time. Where the Labour Party go at this point in time, because he's been in the job now for a year. You can only blame Jeremy Corbyn so much for all the faults and wrongdoings, and we've saw him sack one of his key allies in his cabinet. Is that going to make much difference? We even heard yesterday, should Labour move more back into the middle? Should they abandon the working classes? Should they look at decentralising the party once again and moving more jobs out of London and put them across the UK and trying to even go for that more federal UK? What do you think? Where do Labour go from here? Because it's another disaster.
Well, the interesting thing about the local elections is that it's almost like 2 local elections in one. I think I heard someone say that it's actually the biggest UK-wide election outside of a general election because so many people were voting, because there was meant to be 2020 local elections, there was meant to be a 2020 mayoral election in London, but then there was also meant to be 2021 local elections, so the two were combined. So you had the 2016 result, which was actually pretty good for Labour, and the 2017 result, which was pretty bad for Labour, and Keir Starmer has taken them even further back. So it's actually worse than what Jeremy Corbyn had done. And in fairness to Keir Starmer, I don't think we've actually seen him blame Jeremy Corbyn in name. He said that we still need to win back the trust of voters, which I think is he's sort of referring to Corbyn in 2019.
It's a bit of an understatement as well.
Yeah, a very big understatement. But I think I seen him interviewed on Sky after they'd lost Hartlepool on Friday afternoon, and he was asked, "We need to win back the trust of voters." He was then asked how, and he said, "Well, we need to set out our vision." He was asked what the vision was, and he said, "To win back the trust of voters." So it appears he doesn't have a vision. He doesn't have a policy platform. I mean, one thing that really annoys me is he's talking about radical federalism for the UK and how this will sort of keep Scotland within the UK. He's been leader for 13 months. There's an election in 3 years' time, and he's not named one policy that he would devolve from Westminster to Scotland. So, I mean, I think one of the first things that he should do, instead of sacking Angela Rayner and creating another factional shift in the party, making them look even more divided, is to actually set out some policy proposals and a sort of, even just 5 key policies that they would sort of stand on in both local elections and Westminster elections.
Yeah, I think we saw that faction split between Jeremy Corbyn and Tom Watson very early in Labour, and that obviously didn't end in a good result for the party. Already chat about Andy Burnham possibly coming in there as leader already, which is crazy to think. Everybody thought it'd be sensible to get Keir Starmer in as Labour leader, but it's not worked out as of yet. They've had another bad election. The only positive for Labour is their result in Wales, and we touched on that earlier on. Mark Drakeford. Why do you think it's went so well in Wales but not so well in England?
Yeah, I should just say that Andy Burnham, in his victory speech on, I think it was Saturday, also spoke about radical devolution in England. So I think he's talking about metro mayors there, but obviously Keir Starmer with federalism, that would look like a devolved parliament for the 6 or 7 regions.
It will be interesting to see whether in the next general election this is something that's on the ticket, because it's something that the people of England might buy into, and it could really, really much so favour the Labour Party.
Well, I mean, they've got 3 years to set it out, and they can't just put the word federalism in their manifesto. They need to actually detail how they're going to do it. Like, in fairness, Blair did in 1997 with devolution. But in Wales, Mark Drakeford, it's a record equalling result for the Labour Party. They get 30 seats out of 60, so not quite a majority, but I think they'll be able to pass their legislation quite easily there, because I think there's 12 Plaid MSPs, and I think there's 1 Liberal Democrat as well. So they'll get legislation through quite easily. In terms of Welsh independence, I don't think there's a majority for that yet. I think it's sort of languishing in around 30% mark. So that's a big task for Plaid Cymru. Leanne Wood lost her seat, which I don't think she's in the Senate anymore after 18 years. So that's quite sad for her. But it is a resounding endorsement of Mark Drakeford, who was a Corbyn ally when he got elected as Welsh Labour leader in late 2018. It's a resounding endorsement of his pandemic leadership and his sort of progressive vision for Wales, which is part of the UK.
Yeah, I think pandemic leadership's a really key phrase that you use, Patrick. There's been a lot of criticism directed at each party, respectively in Scotland, England and Wales, but effectively each country stuck with the status quo. Now, do you think in different times, if we hadn't had a pandemic, we would see different results? Because it's almost as if, in Wales, people have been quite satisfied with how Mark Drakeford's done. Boris Johnson's had this kind of kick off the back of the vaccine and people are happy with it. The country's opening up now. And Nicola Sturgeon's, much like Mark Drakeford, good leadership, been there. So do you think that if we hadn't had the pandemic, we'd see very different results and people are just wanting to stick with what they know through this past year?
I think it's an impossible question. I don't think it's a question that you can actually answer. The Tories promised to level up in England, well, across the UK, but obviously England is where there's no devolution. So if there wasn't a pandemic, I think there would have been an increased focus on that. But because of the pandemic, money's been stretched, more borrowing for furlough. They've had a really good excuse, or if you want to call it a reason, not to level up. That will come in the coming months and years. So I think if there wasn't a pandemic, they would have had pressure to level up. Whether they done that or not, I think whether Keir Starmer held them to account on whether they done that or not, you might have seen different results. Mark Drakeford, there seems to be a lot of chat about his sort of plan for government. His policies seem to be really well liked in Wales, so you might have had a similar result. And obviously Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP, I think, were always going to win the election. It was just to what degree. Obviously, they haven't got a majority. I think they probably would have missed out on a majority if there wasn't a pandemic as well. So they might get slightly less than 64, but I think the same parties would have won the elections if it wasn't for the pandemic, just to differing degrees.
Yeah, probably to different degrees. So that's us covered that. I think what we're going to go back on to now is the Scottish election and look at some of the real positives to take from that. So if you want to kind of run us through the breakdown of some of the, politics aside, if you will, tweets that Nicola Sturgeon was putting out that we saw that was quite nice to see.
Yeah, so it was, there was an unfortunate incident, I think, on Friday morning lunchtime, where Pam Duncan-Clancy, who's a wheelchair user.
Permanent wheelchair user, yep.
Yes, and I think she was second on Labour's Glasgow list.
Yep, she also ran in my constituency of Kelvin and did, I think surprisingly well in terms of the vote. And just to give people a bit of context, Patrick Harvey, the co-leader of the Scottish Greens, also ran in Glasgow Kelvin, but Labour seemed to bounce back a wee bit in Glasgow Kelvin. It used to be a stronghold for them.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, not at all. So when she was trying to get into the count for the first time on Friday morning, she asked for a candidate's pass, and the people distributing the passes basically didn't believe her presumably because she was a wheelchair user, and had to wait 45 minutes for it to be cleared up, which is just unacceptable. And it shows you the unconscious bias that still exists in our society. I don't think the person handing out the passes meant any badness, that he didn't believe her, but it's just we don't see wheelchair users, people with visible disabilities, in Parliament enough. 23% of people in Scotland have a disability, not all of them visible, but they have a disability. So I think it's very important that people like Pam are in Parliament, are represented, are seen to be represented, and I think she's a very strong believer in her Labour values, Labour policies. It's by no means a token gesture. She's definitely more than capable of being an MSP. So delighted to see her in Parliament, and obviously you talk about Glasgow Kelvin. I think you'll be more qualified than me to talk about this. Cocab Stewart is the first BAME woman to ever be elected in the 22 years of devolution.
Yeah, if anybody was tuning in, and if you actually look at some, I think it's the front of the Sunday Post today, Cocab is on it. It's my constituency, and I think anybody that lives in Glasgow Kelvin's very proud to see us deliver the very first BAME women to the Scottish Parliament, the first women of colour. Obviously, last year we saw that breakthrough in America as Vice President, with Kamala Harris being the first woman of colour to hold that position. And this year, Scotland has eventually, after 22 years, taken far too long, once again, like Pam, but elected its first woman of colour, which is a great day. Once again, our Parliament should be representative of the people that work in it. I think now, but the people that work in it should be representative of the people of Scotland. I think now we went from 2 BAME candidates in terms of Hamza and Anas Sarwar to 6, I think now. I think we've got a few more. So again, a real big positive to see more people from ethnic backgrounds elected to Holyrood, because the Parliament should be representative of the people that live in the country. And a great breakthrough for Cocab. She first stood in 1999 against Donald Dewar. She's a well liked and known figure in the SNP, and as a teacher. So that will be something that's very interesting in terms of the cabinet, because she knows the difficulties and the challenges. A lot has been made about the SNP's record in education, whether she will get a position and to try and help and sort that. But congratulations to CoCab on her election. So yeah, that's another breakthrough for the Scottish Parliament.
Yeah, and there's now 6 BAME MSPs, as you just said. There was more BAME MSPs elected at this election than there have been in the 5 previous elections combined. There's only ever been 5 BAME election wins in the 5 previous elections. I think it should have been 22 if it was representative of Scotland. I think that's probably gone up to about 26 or 27 now, and there's now been 11 in total from the 6 elections. So still a long way to go, but it's great that there's been a BAME woman, won a constituency, won an MSP place, and I think the Tories have got a BAME woman as well in the West of Scotland list, I want to say. So yes, great progress being made. A long way to go, but we're closer to proper proportional representation of BAME men and women in Parliament.
Yeah, and again, in terms of politics, people might have not got the result that they wanted, but the Parliament is more representative, more women, people from different backgrounds, people to represent the people of Scotland fully. So that can only be a positive. We've already touched on a large voter turnout in the election. So these are all great positives that we can take from the election.
Yeah, exactly. And just to sort of move on from that, we've seen Andrew Wilson as one of the sort of pundits on the BBC's election coverage over the course of the 2 days. In 2018, he published a Growth Commission, which was the sort of SNP's plan for independence. I think it was something like 360 pages. It received a lot of criticism from left of centre people because it meant 10 years of using the pound, not having a central bank, not being able to borrow. Now that means either incredibly high interest rates or austerity, because you can't borrow money. I think that's now out of date because of the pandemic, but even more so because I think independence is becoming a left of centre idea, as opposed to a sort of catch-all idea, left, centre and centre right. So I think in the 2 to 3 years that the SNP have before a potential referendum, they need to set out a new vision. There's also an Emma Harper video. Congratulations to her on being re-elected. An Emma Harper video in where she said that an independent Scotland would create jobs at the border. That met a total backlash because people don't want a hard border. It would create a bit of chaos in the border towns. You've seen the 3 border towns all vote Tory because of the unionists sort of coalescing together. Talk about tactical voting in a minute. But yes, I think they need to come up with a new economic vision, a new border answer, because they currently don't have the best of answers to that.
No.
So in the background, I think people like Andrew Wilson, people like Keith Brown, who stepped away from Cabinet after winning the deputy leadership, and people like Peter Murrell, who's the CEO and Nicola Sturgeon's husband, need to sort of come up with a new vision that's more acceptable than a hard border and a sort of austerity fixed growth commission vision.
Mike Russell might be another guy that could end up in those kind of talks, as well as Rosanna Cunningham. But I think you've got a really good point in terms of, came up in the comments, in terms of currency, borders. These are 2 big questions that people aren't happy with the answers on. It was something that in 2014 a lot of people saw as a real black spot in the actual plan of independence, and something that if the SNP, the Greens, or whoever else want to win independence, we'll really need to answer. But yeah, tactical voting. Now, people would have found, as I touched on at the beginning of the show, that the system that we use, especially that second D'Hondt system, as it's called, a bit confusing as to what happens. But it did work in some areas in terms of the constituency seat in the first vote, tactical voting, didn't it?
It did. It worked basically everywhere where the Unionists held their seat. Didn't work in Ayr, East Lothian, or Edinburgh Central, because those were SNP gains, but there was no Unionist gain on the constituency. Yeah, you've seen people like Alex Cole-Hamilton increase his majority massively. That was a Lib Dem gain last time. It's now
That's
it's one of the
Edinburgh Western.
Sorry,
Yep.
yes, not Edinburgh Central. That's Angus Robertson. But yes, in Edinburgh Western, Alex Cole-Hamilton. I think that was a seat the SNP were probably looking to gain because they didn't have any Lothian list MSPs. So that would have been a sort of net gain, if you will. That would have been disappointing because that was, I think, Seva Masson was the candidate there. Katrina, I think McDonald, I want to say, in Edinburgh Southern.
That rings a bell, yep.
Lost out to Daniel Johnson. I think he maybe increased his majority, I'm not too sure. I don't think it was so obvious, the tactical voting. It was very obvious in Aberdeenshire West, where the Tories massively increased their majority from, I think, 900 to 3,500. The 20% of the Lib Dems, that was cut down to 8. Some of it went to the SNP, but a lot of it went to the Tory party. Tactical voting, I think, increased Jackson Carlow's majority in Eastwood.
Yes.
The Tories coalesced around Jackie Bailey in Dumbarton. She increased her majority from, I think, 109 to almost 1,200. I think in Dumfriesshire, Oliver Mundell, the Labour vote coalesced around the Tory party because of the Unionists' sort of fears about the border. And I think Ettrick was the only one where there was no tactical voting because the Tories are almost like genuinely strong there. There's no, they've always been quite, they're all quite safe now because of tactical voting, but I think that was safe already. I don't think the SNP ever had any hopes of taking that.
Yeah, and on tactical voting in the systems, basically the list, two of the big political figures we mentioned on Tuesday were Alex Salmond and George Galloway. No breakthroughs from both of them. Where do you think these two political figures go in Scottish politics now? Because Alaba didn't break through at all. They've still got people, 2 Westminster MPs, have got councillors still, and 5,000 members. Where do they go as a political party? Do you still see Alex Salmond continuing to lead Alaba?
Well, it's interesting because we're 52 minutes into an hour-long show and we've mentioned Alex Salmond for the first time. So I think that shows how resoundingly he was rejected at the ballot box. I was listening to his comments almost as soon as counting started and he didn't sound too optimistic. And then at the end, he seemed optimistic about Alaba's future. Alapa, I should say. I think he'll continue to lead the party. It's all right,
they get it wrong as well. We've actually got somebody come in called Alba Rhodes saying hopefully Salmond and Galloway can disappear now. So I think they agree with your point that after 52 minutes, they're hoping that me and you shut up about the two of them.
I know. Oh well. Yeah, I think they get average 2%. I think I saw on the BBC website in total they get 1.6% on the list, and I think it was in the North East it was quite high. Clydebank and Milngavie in the west of Scotland, it was quite high. I say high, 2.5%. So they've got 2 MPs and I think they've got 20 councillors. So it'll be interesting because I think Alex Salmond has created that party just to get himself into the Parliament. That hasn't happened. So whether he can lead the party being a private citizen when they've got 22 elected members is quite a challenge for him. There might be a bit of a coup from either Neil Hanvey or Kenny McCaskill. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the council elections, whether the 20 councillors you would imagine would try and retain their seats.
And stand in an Alaba.
On an Alaba ticket, well,
yeah.
I can't see them being allowed into any other political party, to be honest, certainly not the SNP. So it's either that or stand as an independent. They'll look to keep all their seats. I can't see that happening. So you could actually see them from a standing start actually go backwards in the council elections if they choose to stand. When it comes to national politics, there isn't another national election for 3 years.
No.
Alex Salmond will be 69 by that time. You just don't know. I think Kenny McCaskill will be pushing 70 by that time as well. So,
and I don't think Margaret Ferrier, after her actions, which is still being investigated into, will probably be given the trust by the people.
No, I can't see that
Rutherglen again.
No, I can't see that at all. So it'll be interesting. On George Galloway's party, I think up until Alapa was formed, George Galloway's list party, All for Unity, was probably going to be the joke list party, but then Alex Salmond totally outdone him there. So I never really expected them to get a seat. George, I think, stood in the South of Scotland list, didn't come close. So I think that'll be quickly disbanded, to be honest, because George Galloway was the only big name, and he's already leading 2 other parties down in England. So it's a matter of how many parties can he actually lead at the one time, while also being a platform for Russian propaganda on RT.
Yes, 2 big figures not making the breakthrough, and they actually nearly cost his side, the Unionists, a seat in the South of Scotland, taking a part of the Tory vote. So I think it's going to be something that Unionist side will definitely look at. Alaba not breaking through at all with nationalists, by the looks of it. I think if anybody seriously at this point in time is considering independence, that they're not voting for Alaba. Unfortunately for their perspective, they're either giving their votes to the Scottish National Party or the Scottish Greens, because they saw that they'd be the only 2 parties that would really break through from that. Again, both of them have did well. The biggest pro-independence majority in the history of Holyrood we've got so far. It'll be interesting to see what happens to those 2 figures. Anything else you want to touch on before we wrap it up here? In terms of what we can expect maybe from the next 5 years of Holyrood?
Yeah, just on the recovery, you've got 64 SNP MSPs, 22 Labour and 8 Green. So that's that's the left of centre parties having 94 seats out of 129. Even if they have a presiding officer, it's 93 seats. They outdo the Tories 3-1, which I think is an argument for independence. It would mean that the Tories would sort of never get anywhere near government because they've never had more than 25% of the seats. Even if they get a plurality, Labour, SNP, Green could work together, form a coalition to keep them out. I think that's an argument for independence. But on the recovery, I think all parties are committed to a national care service. SNP have promised dental charges will be scrapped. I think Labour and Green will support that. The Greens will push for rent controls. I'm not sure that will get through. Hopefully there is more safety and security, rent freezes, eviction freezes for renters, because renters are obviously on relatively low incomes. The pandemic will hit them the hardest. And there's a whole range of other progressive policies. You could see a small tax rise, income tax rise for the highest earners to sort of boost the recovery. So the recovery will be interesting. It will certainly be a left of centre led recovery, which will be good for Scotland.
Yeah, I think that'll benefit a lot of Scottish people. And again, one of the other promises in the SNP manifesto was to nationalise ScotRail, which is certainly something the Greens will support and maybe push them a wee bit further on, which I think to anybody that's listening that usually regularly uses a train should be a positive thing.
100%. It'll mean cheaper fares, you would assume, more services. They will be accountable to government, ScotRail. It's not just, this is a private company. You just need to like it or lump it with the late trains, the cancelled trains. The government will be held to account on their performance on this. We've obviously had Fraser Stewart and 2 Green candidates on the podcast. A lot of the climate talk is around transport. The SNP have promised to retrofit 1 million homes in Scotland by 2030. That's important, but again, the climate talk is a lot centred on transport. So if you can have a green transport transformation, which will be possible if ScotRail is owned publicly, and potentially a publicly owned energy company, that would be another positive, which I think Labour will support. So you could see bold moves on the economy, on social issues, and on the climate, and that will be all really, really important for the recovery going forward.
Yeah, I think one of our friends, Marcus, made a very interesting point to both of us in saying that over the next few years, the Scottish Government, which will be backed and propped up by the Scottish Greens, should definitely make the most of the limited powers which we have to really prove to the people of Scotland what an independent Scotland could do. Another real point that we spoke about on the podcast with Neil Findlay was drugs. We've got a new minister in there in terms of Angela Constance, who I think will do a lot better job than Joe Fitzpatrick. It maybe showed that the SNP can stand anybody in any area and win. Joe didn't have a great time as drugs minister, was sacked by Nicola Sturgeon in that position, but still came back with a stonking majority in Dundee. So,
which is the drugs capital of Scotland, the drug death
yeah,
capital of Scotland. So it just shows you.
But do you think Angela Constance will certainly try and do a bit more in this parliament? We heard what Neil was saying on the podcast, that he would decriminalise drugs, but it was talking about the test that Labour do in Wales. With you send it back and it tells you the result. Do you think that could be something that we introduce here in Scotland?
Yeah, I think Neil said that there's something like 16 things the government can challenge the Lord Advocate on. They can't decriminalise drugs, they can't legalise them. So you just sort of need to push Westminster to do that, unfortunately. So I think there's quite a few things Angela Constance can do. One thing that's important is that the drug deaths that were announced were for 2019. I think for 2020 they will be worse because of the pandemic. There'll be a lot of people hitting hard times, maybe turn to drugs. So I think you'll actually see higher numbers in Angela Constance's first year, but that'll be the work of Joe Fitzpatrick. So yeah, I mean, she probably can't do a worse job, if I'm being honest. If she does, it will be an absolute disaster for public health. But yeah, I think funding is probably the main issue. If you open sort of health centres, drug prevention centres, and if they can really push the Lord Advocate on what Peter Crikant is doing with safe consumption areas all across Scotland, that'll be a massive help, because I think that's reduced overdose deaths by about 50% in Switzerland. So yeah, that's one real positive.
Hopefully get Peter on the podcast. To everybody that's tuning in, we'd just like to say a massive thank you. We've got some great guests coming over the next few weeks. Please get involved in the comments on that. If you do have any suggestions, please comment under the video of any guests you'd like to see appear on the podcast. But just at this point in time, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in, and thank you for joining us on the State of Politics.